Welcome to the Fear and Greed Weekend Edition, the week that was, a wrap of the biggest stories over the past 7 days. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. How are you today?
I'm going pretty well, thanks. Sean, it's been a big week, hasn't it?
It's been a really big week. Opening up of economies, people getting back to normal next week. It's pretty exciting, really.
Yeah, big week for bond markets, for Bitcoin, for bashing up corporates.
Oh, the alliteration, Michael. I like it.
I'm a wordsmith, what can I say? As well as climate change negotiations, opening up economies, as you said. Massive week. Let's get into it. But first, actually, before we go any further, I'm just going to give a quick mention to our newsletter. We've had a lot of people signing up over the last week to our free weekly newsletter, an email every morning at 6 a.m, completely free. Sign up at fearandgreed.com.au. Right, Sean, you're about to tell me that it was a busy week in financial markets.
It's always a busy week in financial markets. In the local market, there were plenty of AGMs being held and quarterly updates. In short, the companies involved in commodities are having a great time, and those hit by COVID are having a bad time. No surprises there, really. Aussie equities had a decent week. The trend was positive, though the S&P ASX 200 is still around 3% off its all-time highs. There is definitely a sense of confidence among investors at the moment as state economies reopen, though the potential for inflation is causing some concerns. Now, inflation really plays out in the bond market. Bonds sold off this week on inflation fears. Bear with me for a moment here, Michael. Investors are worried that if they hold a bond, which provides a fixed return, they'll be left at the station when prices and interest rates start to rise. So when investors think there's inflation in the offing, they think interest rates might rise, so they start selling bonds.
I reckon that's the best description of bonds I've ever heard. You've done the impossible. You've helped me to understand it. Well done.
Yeah, I've been trying with you for about 18 months, so thanks for that. The funny thing about all this, of course, is that the Reserve Bank doesn't seem worried about inflation. This week, its minutes were released from its board meeting of 2 weeks ago, and it said inflation was more of a concern overseas. In short, there's this big disconnect between the Reserve Bank and investors.
All right, putting bonds to one side now that I understand it, we can comfortably do that. There's been a lot of attention on energy prices this week as well.
Sure has. Oil prices remain really high, so too gas and coal prices, though the latter two came off a bit in the past couple of days. There's a global energy crisis going on, undoubtedly, particularly in China and Europe, and it could well get worse as we head into the Northern Hemisphere winter. Base metal prices also remain high. Now, Michael, it was a good week for the Aussie dollar, appreciating against the US dollar. Another economics lesson here, Michael. Short-term moves in the dollar often reflect interest rate expectations, and Australia is not expected to lift interest rates. So you'd think that that would have downward pressure on the dollar. But longer term, it's more about economic fundamentals, and commodity prices kick in there, particularly when the prices are so high, and that supports the dollar. That's why many analysts think the dollar over the next 6, 12, 18 months will actually rise.
All right, I reckon in about 18 months I'll understand that one, so just keep at it.
Thank you. Wall Street quarterly earnings season is underway, and so far so good. The standout has been Tesla, the electric car maker. It reported a 3-month profit of $1.6 billion.
All right, let's have a look at local news for the week. And the great climate change debate continued. Now, it's not really a debate because the science has been settled, so there's no debate over that. What is going on, though, is a furious negotiation between the Libs and the Nats on the climate change policy that they're planning on taking to Glasgow. End of the week, looks like there's a price for national support, and we should find out what that is in the next 48 hours.
Yes. I bet the price will be lots of funding for all sorts of bush programs pushed by the Nationals. Now, next weekend, Scott Morrison goes to Glasgow. That's the United Nations COP26 Climate Change Summit. He needs to go with a plan in his back pocket. At these summits, people want to know what countries are going to do about reaching net zero. Some have committed already, Japan and South Korea. China has said it will reach carbon neutrality by 2060. That's the really big one. What we want to hear next week is how Beijing is actually going to do it. We want to know what India is going to do, and we want to know what Australia is going to do. That's why Morrison needs a plan, built it out with the Nats over the next couple of days. Now, you can be critical of the Nats, but remember, they're just serving their constituents. So they're actually doing the right thing by the people who voted them in. So it really is a negotiation, but very hard to find a middle line.
Yeah, they're really pushing it right down to the very last minute, aren't they? There's not long to go now and a lot of pressure on to find a result.
Yeah, I mean, it always happens in politics, but you wonder whether the best policy comes out of decisions made on a deadline. I suspect not.
Well, at least there'll be a decision made. That's
right.
The main thing. Now, the tax man is on the hunt for missing tax. This was a big story late in the week.
Sure was. Apparently $12.5 billion is owed by small and medium-sized businesses and about $8 billion from individuals. The Australian Tax Office said too many small businesses are still operating in the cash economy. Couldn't agree more.
Now, tell me about the wine figures. We know that it's been a tough year for wine exporters and winemakers. Just how tough was it?
Well, exports fell 24% to $2.3 billion, according to Wine Australia figures out this week. That's for the 12 months to the end of September. Volumes were lower, and the average value of a litre of wine exported also fell. Now, we know the big reason there is that mainland China put on tariffs on Australian exports. Also not helping, though, with the relatively small vintages from 2018 to 2020. So that's that 3-year period. This year, 2021, the vintage has been much, much bigger, and that will feed through in the next couple of years. What we did find out from the Wine Australia figures is that the United Kingdom is now our main market. We've also got growth in Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea.
A quick one as well about super funds, Sean.
Yeah, I know you like this one, Michael. Chant West said super funds will have their first negative month in more than a year with median growth down 1%. That's for the September month. And then later in the week, Rainmaker International came out and said they'd done a study and retail funds still charge about twice as much as not-for-profit funds. And an example of a not-for-profit fund, of course, is an industry fund. So the moral of all that is check the fees you pay in your super funds.
Absolutely. After all, it's your money.
Too right.
Why wouldn't you check? I've been keeping an eye on the ICAC inquiry this week. Sean, this is in New South Wales, and the inquiry into whether former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian behaved appropriately when a $5.5 million grant was awarded to a Wagga gun club. Wagga in the state southwest is the electorate of Darryl Maguire. So he was the former MP, the disgraced former MP who was secretly having an affair with Ms. Berejiklian. It's been a very interesting week.
It sure has, and it'll get better next week when Ms. Berejiklian appears. The Teflon-esque qualities of Gladys seem to have diminished somewhat this week, especially when former Premier Mike Baird came out and said he was incredulous, that was his word, when he heard about the relationship between Maguire and Ms. Berejiklian. He said he would have wanted it declared at the time. He was Premier when Gladys Berejiklian was Treasurer and the $5.5 million was granted. I think Ms. Berejiklian is in some trouble.
Yeah, it's certainly not looking as good for her as it did this time last week. Now, Sean, it would not be a chat about local news without a mention of the housing market.
True, Michael. The housing market just keeps getting stronger. Remember last week you had the new rules around lending requirements. That seemed to trigger a surge in sales. Clearance rates last weekend were really high, particularly in Canberra, Perth, Adelaide and Sydney. It'll be interesting to see how they go this weekend.
All right, let's have a look now at corporate news, and the corporate takeover frenzy kept going this week. It seems like this is now a permanent fixture on Fear and Greed. An update on the latest takeovers and mergers.
I reckon we talk about this as much as we do the housing market. That's saying something.
That certainly is.
Aristocrat Leisure bid $3.9 billion for Playtech. That's an online real money gaming site, so people are using their own money as opposed to just a gaming site. Aristocrat's a really interesting company. It's our biggest gaming company. It's the 16th biggest on the bourse. There have been new regulations in the US which has made that market very attractive to gaming companies. Until very recently, it was actually quite difficult to bet online over there, and that's all changing now. Shareholders certainly like the deal and sent Aristocrat's share price much higher. Rail operator Horizon will pay $2.4 billion to acquire One Rail Australia from the Macquarie Group. There's a bunch of smaller deals announced in the energy, gold and wealth management sectors. And Michael, my favourite of all, Tasmanian whiskey distiller Lark wants to buy the Pontyfull distillery and estate in Tasmania to help it become the Penfolds of whiskey.
It's a pretty lofty goal, isn't it?
It is.
We'll
Aspirational.
Yeah, certainly is. Now, we talked a bit about miners through the week and cracks in the big miners starting to appear in both BHP and Rio.
That's right. They announced the third consecutive quarter of lower iron ore production. In BHP's case, it also said its production of copper, nickel and thermal coal had fallen. The negative side of booming commodity prices is that you can hide plenty of sins behind big profits. What we saw this week is that the miners have really struggled finding staff and fixing equipment. It just shows that beneath the big profits, the miners have plenty of work to do. Mind you, Rio did say it would spend $10 billion over the next 9 years to halve its carbon emissions.
Now, Sean, if we agree that housing is probably one of our main stories we mentioned, and number 2 is takeovers and mergers, I reckon number 3 would probably be Crown Resorts, only because it is the company that just keeps on giving as a news story.
It sure does. This week, Crown Resorts received a second strike at its annual general meeting, which triggered a spill motion for the board. Now, the motion didn't pass, so in the end, all the board members kept their job. But this is 2 years in a row that shareholders have voted against the remuneration report. They're not happy with the massive payments made to departing executives and the fact that they can't get a licence in New South Wales and the fact that they're waiting to hear on the Victorian Royal Commission to see if it keeps its licence in Victoria. Shareholders are not happy.
And fair enough too. Now, a few other quick corporate stories. One from CSL, Sean.
Yeah, it's starting new phase 3 trials in a drug called Kcentra. It treats severe bleeding. CSL, which is Australia's second largest company, has a number of drugs in phase 3 trials. Tabcorp was out this week as well. It said wagering revenue was lower, and boss David Attenborough reckons online bookies should give more revenue to the racing industry. Tabcorp pays 40% of its revenue to the racing industry. He claims the online bookies only pay 20%. Transurban, the toll road group, said traffic numbers were down, no surprises there. Oil and gas group Woodside said revenue had jumped sharply during the September quarter on the back of higher prices. Brambles can't find enough pallets, notwithstanding it already has 345 million pallets and crates and containers across 60 countries. The boom in online shopping means that wholesalers and retailers need more pallets. Brambles are trying to supply them. And finally, there were mixed reports from the retailers, but the Retail Traders Association said nearly $60 billion would be spent in the next couple of months in the run-up to Christmas. It should be boom times.
Hey, Sean, you skipped over it fairly quickly, but the Tabcorp boss, David Attenborough, imagine going through corporate life with a name like that.
I agree. I have met him. He's a very nice fella and nothing like David Attenborough.
That has to be the worst David Attenborough impersonation I have ever heard.
Can we talk international news, Michael?
We can talk international news. And first up was a story that broke earlier in the week, and Colin Powell, who was a US war hero and the first African-American Secretary of State, died of complications from COVID-19.
He sure did. People of that generation remember Colin Powell, a very commanding presence, and as you said, the first Afro-American Secretary of State, most famous for convincing George W. Bush, the president, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which in hindsight was probably not true. A couple of other interesting international stories. China's economy slowed to a 4.9% pace during the September quarter on the back of the energy shortages I mentioned before, property sector debt and shutdowns as a result of COVID, and New Zealand's annual inflation rate is close to 5%. Now, the central bank in New Zealand has already started lifting interest rates. There might be more of those in the offing. The other news out of New Zealand is that case numbers of COVID are surging.
Okay, Sean, now we get to the point in the program where we go through the biggest story of the week, the sleeper story, the most remarkable story, and our favourite story, and see if we agree on any or maybe even all of them.
Perhaps. Righto.
I don't think that's going to happen. What's the biggest story for you this week?
Well, I try and stay away from COVID news as the biggest story of the week, but it still is.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid, isn't it?
Absolutely. A bunch of things happening. Just the numbers to begin with. There was a rise in numbers in New South Wales and Victoria in the past couple of days. You can expect more of those as economies reopen. Of course, yesterday the Victorian economy reopened. The vaccination rate just keeps climbing. That's great news. We're actually at an 81% first jab rate nationally, and 71% of Australians are vaccinated. New South Wales is well and truly leading the way there. Businesses are jumping on board the whole vaccination story. Woolworths mandated that its 170,000 workers be vaccinated. Wesfarmers said new employees had to be vaccinated. Aldi will mandate vaccinations. We already know Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, BHP, Qantas, Virgin, some law and accounting firms, aged care workers, New South Wales and Victorian health workers, Victorian construction workers, all operate under a mandated vaccination rule. So that's doing really, really well. As a result, in New South Wales, which is actually at an 83% full vaccination rate, the new Premier, Dominic Perrottet, is reopening the economy really, really quickly, and that's helping business in that state. Victorian businesses should benefit from the fact that it came out of lockdown yesterday. Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk outlined the reopening map for that state, and everyone should be able to visit Queensland from the middle of December. There's changes to quarantine rules around the country, much less onerous for vaccinated travellers. Even Western Australia said it would open its borders, mind you, only to Queenslanders. All that's great, Michael, but you know the best part of the COVID news this week?
Go on. What was it?
It's all about international travel. Qantas yesterday said it would bring forward flights into and out of Sydney to a bunch of international destinations. Singapore, a bubble with Singapore is likely to be established in the next week. It's also organising flights to Bangkok, Phuket, Johannesburg, Fiji, Delhi will come online shortly, and then Honolulu, Vancouver, Tokyo and New Zealand are next in line. All 11,000 employees stood down by Qantas will be back at work in December. Such a good news story.
That is a fantastic news story, and I completely agree with you that COVID this week has been the biggest story, and it's nice to actually finish on a bit of a positive note there.
Right, I'm going to take the lead here. The sleeper story, Michael, because I don't want you agreeing with me. So what's your favourite? What's your sleeper story?
In that case, I will get in first. And mine is actually one that you covered on Thursday, and it's the number of bank branches and ATMs that have disappeared over the last year. Nearly 10% of branches shut down last year. Nearly 20% of the ATM network around the country disappeared. There's a couple of reasons for it. People don't like handling cash in a COVID world. I get that. But also branches are expensive things to run, and especially when there's a lot of other options now, like online banking, using apps for banking, mobile lenders, that kind of thing. It's the sleeper story for me because if this happened 15 or 20 years ago, this number of bank branches closing would have caused an uproar. But today it doesn't, because the world is changing. People are getting used to different ways of banking, which is why I think it's pretty much the sleeper story of the week.
Very good call. Very good call. My sleeper story was the report that came out saying Rio Tinto was at best incompetent and at worst deliberately deceived traditional owners over plans to blast the Yukon Gorge in May last year. Now, the parliamentary inquiry delivered its final report, and it recommended sweeping legislative changes across the country to prevent anything similar happening. If you're in the mining industry or invest in mining companies, many of us do that, this is big, big news. There'll be a battle now between government and traditional landowners and miners about how to develop new rules around mining. And it will not be as favourable to the miners as it is right now. That's why I think it's a sleeper story.
Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good one. But I'm not going to concede to you just yet.
That's fine.
Most remarkable story. What was your pick for the week?
Donald J. Trump is back. He's starting Truth social media. He's been kicked off Twitter and Facebook. So if you've got as much money as Donald Trump and the profile he has, he just decides to start his own network. I think that's pretty remarkable. He'll attract fans, no doubt about it. And can you imagine some of the stuff that will be on it?
Oh, dear Lord. You know, my favourite part of this story is that it's going to launch next year, but selected invited guests will be able to join from next month. Can you imagine the kind of people that will be invited to join the Truth social media network next month? And how does one get one of these invitations?
I'd love one. You've got to give it to Trump. He's very entrepreneurial. He's not everyone's cup of tea, but he's extremely entrepreneurial. And there are figures this week that showed that CNN and MSNBC, the news cable channels, halved their ratings compared to 12 months ago when Trump was president.
That's extraordinary. You are right. It's certainly very good for the theatre and the drama, wasn't he?
Yes. I've got a second place too. Can I put that in?
Oh, if you must, go on.
The story, which I have no idea whether it's true, that Facebook might be rebranding, changing its name and rebranding.
Yeah, good one. Okay,
I'm-
so you've had two stories there. Mine is better than both of those as the most remarkable story, and it is about Bitcoin.
Of course it is.
Of course it is. Bitcoin hit a record this week, $66,000. That's pretty amazing. That is pretty impressive. One of the main reasons was the launch of the first crypto exchange-traded fund on Wall Street. To me, it's my favorite story, though, because of the volatility over the last few months and the recovery that it's made in that time. It got as low as $30,000 when it was hit by a few problems, criticism over energy consumption. At the same time, Beijing was cracking down on digital currencies. So to be hitting new highs within a few months, that's pretty impressive and pretty remarkable, I would say.
Sure is. On to our favourite story. Michael, mine is all about golf.
That does not surprise me. You are quite a golf fan.
The fact that a game that takes 4 hours or more has experienced a massive resurgence in 2021, because of COVID, I think is quite fantastic. It sort of typifies the way society has had to take a breather over the past 18 months. Basically, golf's one of the few things people could do. It takes a long time and people went out and did it. I just think that during lockdowns, people have had more time to do stuff, play golf or spend it with families. I'm actually going to miss that just a little bit.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that one, actually. I think you've almost swayed me on my favorite. Almost swayed me on my favourite. Sorry, I will still nominate one because I'm not going to fold quite that easily. Netflix has had a cracking quarter thanks to Squid Game, which is the South Korean mega hit. It has gone absolutely gangbusters for the streaming service. Did you know that Netflix now has 213 million subscribers globally?
Really?
And how about their profit, the third quarter profit for Netflix, $1.4 billion US. That is up from $790 million US. That is pretty impressive. And a lot of that additional revenue has come from new subscribers being attracted by Squid Game. I still haven't seen it.
Okay, you might have swayed me. I swayed you on golf. You've swayed me on Squid Game.
So we've essentially just swapped stories.
That's right. Go watch Squid Game this weekend. It's a good story. Go watch Squid Game this week. It's a good show.
Okay, will do. Moving on to this week's interviews, we've had some good chats this week. On Monday, you spoke to Alex Vinocour from Beta Shares. Obviously, I would have been interested in this one because it was about getting exposure to cryptocurrencies without actually buying them.
Yes, the Beta Shares ETF is a very different model, which just allows you exposure to that market, basically buying into the back end of it as opposed to the cryptocurrencies themselves. Reduces volatility, and quite an attractive idea.
Tuesday was Peter Colaccino from Infrastructure Australia.
Yeah, he provided a roadmap for infrastructure in Australia. We all talk about it as being a hot investment area and the super funds love it, but it was a bit of a bigger picture look at where Australia's going in that area.
Wednesday, no surprises that we enjoyed this chat. Duncan Hogg from EY on the deal frenzy that's been engulfing the markets lately.
Initial public offerings, mergers and acquisitions, the whole lot. Duncan, he's an expert in this area, and we've had him on a few times before. He's very excited about this whole corporate activity going on. Well worth a listen.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that. Thursday, you spoke to Craig Cowdrey. This was an interesting one. He is the co-founder and the chief executive of Sonda, which is a health and safety business with a bit of a difference.
Definitely with a difference. One of the really interesting parts of their business is the first responder business. So if someone is in physical or emotional distress, they can get people to sites within minutes. Kind of very interesting business model.
Yeah, it certainly is. I would definitely recommend going back and having a listen to that one if you missed it. And then finally, yesterday, you spoke to Luke Clark from Canon Business Services.
We talked about how technology has impacted work and how it will into the future. Again, a very futuristic look at a really important part of the economy, particularly now as we're all trying to work out whether to go back to the office or not.
Now, if you want to listen to any of those interviews or indeed any of the shows from the past week, all are available on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. I think, though, Sean, for me, the highlight of this week has been your David Attenborough impersonation.
Thank you very much. Let's just move on and you enjoy your weekend, Michael.
Thank you, Sean. You too. Don't forget that tomorrow, Sean and I will be back with Adam Lang from the Fear and Greed team to have a bit of a lighter look at some of the news around the place. I'm Michael Thompson. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.